We are now recording, and Jeanne.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone coming from so far away and so close by. So it's just great. I'm Jeanne James, the president for the Canberra Jung Society, and thank you for joining us again online. So this evening, we're delighted to welcome Dr. David Russell, joining us from his home in Sydney. David will be speaking about how a Jungian perspective makes a unique contribution to understanding emotional trauma. Through a retelling of the fairy tale, The Handless Maiden, he will illustrate how a Jungian sensitivity gives insight into both the nature of the trauma and the necessary steps to recover. He will explain how understanding and therapy aims to integrate the inner life with the outer life, and how this is often achieved with imaginary and narrative, as documented and found in so-called fairy stories. We've been privileged to have David as a speaker a number of times at our face-to-face meetings, but this is the first time that we're meeting him online, although we saw him in Melbourne online. David Russell is a past president of the Sydney Jung Society. He completed his studies and research in psychology at the University of Sydney. After a few years in private practice, he moved into an academic career, leading to establishment of the Master of Analytical Psychology degree, the University of Western Sydney. David has currently returned to private practice in Sydney. David will talk to us for about an hour, then we'll move into questions and discussion. We'll ask that you remain muted while David is speaking to avoid background noise, and then we'll come together for discussion. You can always make comments using the Zoom chat button. So I'll hand you over to David. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Jeanne. It's a pleasure to be here, even if the medium is a bit difficult, but I guess we're all getting used to it by now. So tonight's topic, as Jeanne mentioned, is how a Jungian perspective makes a unique contribution to understanding emotional trauma. And this title needs a bit of an explanation because I'm not a Jungian analyst, I'm a Jungian psychologist. And so my perspective on Jung's perspective is going to come from that world of psychology and my particular take on it. I'll use as my overall impulse, if you like, a quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a collaborator, very close collaborator with Jung during his professional life. And her words are, "We try to understand the psyche by means of the psyche." Now that's a profound statement to my mind, that we understand the psyche by means of the psyche. So we don't do the usual thing and try to understand it conceptually or theoretically or even experientially. We try to understand the psyche by means of the psyche. The other little bit of understanding from where I'm coming from is that I only know Jung through his writings and the writings of those others who were inspired by his words and images and ideas. And I first encountered Jung as an academic psychologist working in a school of psychology in the university. And as such, I needed to take a position because, as you probably all know, Jung is not mainstream in psychology, in academic psychology. He's considered just out of the box. He doesn't rate importance. And that's the mainstream of psychology. And in a way, I respect where they're coming from, in as much as I respect what is known in the clinical field as best practice. But to my mind, and I'm agreeing with Carl Jung in this regard, it's way too lopsided, too limited. It reduces trauma, the experience of trauma, to an aspect. And in my mind, this both applies to its possible origin and possible treatment. So, what makes Jung worthy of our consideration tonight? Firstly, I assert that he doesn't privilege the ego, which is again unusual in mainstream psychology, which is very much about the ego. Then he doesn't speak with a single voice. There are many Jungs, if you like. And my version is just another version of Jung. His truth is multiple. So there is no single truth to be discovered, no true Jung. As a writer and a lecturer, I always found him a bit of a trickster. He wants to make it a bit difficult for us. He doesn't want to lay out a map, a pathway for us to follow easily. However, all the time, Jung has helped me think. And right from the start of my engagement with Jung, I found that incredibly valuable. So besides these defining characteristics, and perhaps most relevant of all, is his emphasis on images and our feelings associated with images, and to be guided by these images. And so it's for this reason that I'm using as my central focus tonight one of the fairy tales from the Grimm brothers collection, The Handless Maiden. But even before I begin telling that story, I want to say a few more things. That for Jung, myths and fairy tales are akin to cultural dreams. And as in all dreams, the characters, the events, the physical settings can be understood as aspects of the inner life. This is very challenging to see that every aspect of a dream or a fairy story as the workings of one's inner life, because we are so easily seduced to try and make sense of them from our ordinary everyday perspective. And Jung's manner of working was what he called circumambulation, walking around and around whatever the experience happened to be that he was focusing on. And with this manner of working in mind, I'd like to remind you that this year, 2020, Rosie Batty's son Luke would have had his 18th birthday. Now, a lot of people wanted to put her on a pedestal. She was made Australian of the Year only 10 months after her son's death. Some, like Mark Latham, said that she was benefiting from her son's death. So we as a collective made her both a saint and a villain. But as a person, she was left to grieve in private. As a person, we didn't really know her. Now, this frames what's important about Jung, because in his psychotherapeutic practice, above all else, he wanted to know his patient. It wasn't the presenting symptoms that he focused on, it was the person as a person. So he was no Wizard of Oz, the old man behind the curtain, pulling the strings. The people who went to see Jung met Jung, and he met them as a person. And again, this is quite different to what usually happens today. When we are trained to look and work with the presenting problem. So now I'll tell the story. I'll tell the story just as it is recorded, and then we'll, as it were, tease apart certain of the big themes to explore psychologically, imaginatively, emotionally. The story begins recounting that a miller had fallen into great poverty. and all that he had left for his family was the mill itself and a large tree that grew out the back. One day he was in the forest gathering firewood, and he came across an old man he had never met before. And the old man said to him, "What are you doing all this wood collecting for? You don't have to. I can make you rich in every possible way. All I want from you is what is standing behind your mill." The miller thought, well, that must be the apple tree. That's the only thing standing behind my mill. This sounds like a good deal. So he said, yes, you can have what's standing behind my mill. And the old man smirked and said, "Ha, I'll come back in 3 years and collect what is owed to me." When the miller got home to his wife, she said, "You can't believe this. What has happened? Our cupboards are full of wonderful things. There's food, there's clothing, there's cloth. Where did it all come from? No one brought it here." And so the miller recounts that while he was collecting wood in the forest, he met an old man who offered him all these riches, and all he had to do was guarantee that the old man could have what was standing behind the mill. Well, the wife said, "You fool, you fool, you foolish old man. What was behind our mill was our daughter. She was sweeping the yard. You have given our daughter to the devil. That was no old man, that's the evil one." So for 3 years, the little family, mother, father, daughter, lived with all these riches, nothing at all to worry about. Didn't even have to work the mill. And exactly as the end of the 3rd year came about, the devil turned up early in the morning to collect what was his due. And the young woman, the daughter, had lived a very devoted, pious life over the 3 years. And she prepared herself for this meeting. She washed her hands thoroughly, and she drew a circle of chalk around her. And the devil came in to collect her, and he could not approach her. He couldn't gain any power over her. He was totally angry. And he said to the miller, "Don't let this happen again. I'm coming back tomorrow, and I don't want any water to have touched her hands." So the next morning, the devil turns up, but the young woman had cried so much that her hands were totally clean, and the devil couldn't approach her. So he said again in great anger to the miller, "Chop off her hands. I want you to chop off her hands. Only then can I be sure that no water has touched them, and I can possess her." The miller said, "I can't do that. She's my daughter." And he said, the devil said, "Either you do that or I'll take you. You will be mine." So the miller was terribly afraid, and out of that fear he gave in. He agreed to the devil. He agreed to chop off his daughter's hands. So he came to his daughter and said, "I've done this terrible thing. Please forgive me. I have to chop off your hands, otherwise the devil will take me." And she says, as the dutiful daughter we can imagine says, "Father, you do with me what you need to do. I am your daughter." So terrible event happens. He chops off her hands. The devil comes the next morning to collect her. But again, she had wept so bitterly that the tears had washed her stumps clean. And the devil could not approach her, and again had no power over her. And off he goes, stomping his way out of the door, mumbling to himself, "You haven't heard the last of me." So the father, the miller, says to his daughter, "You can stay here with us. We'll look after you now. We have all that we need. Physically, financially, we don't have to worry." But in that moment, the daughter says, "I cannot stay here. I cannot stay here. I cannot live in this place. She had the stumps of her arms tied behind her back, and she left the house into the forest, walked all day on her own. And as the sun set, and by the light of the full moon, she saw that she had arrived at a royal orchard. There were beautiful pears. Each pear was numbered, but she couldn't approach it because there was a moat of water surrounding the orchard. So in desperation, her hunger being so great and her inability to do anything with her hands tied behind her back, she implored God to help her. Please, God, I don't know what to do. I'm totally helpless and hopeless here. And in that moment, an angel appeared to her and dried up the moat so that she could cross it, and went with her into the orchard. She was able, with her mouth, to take a pear off one of the trees and ate it and was satisfied, left the orchard and went to have a rest to sleep that night in the bush. The angel stayed by her side. The next morning, seeing this was a royal orchard, the king arrives, and it was his practice to count his fruit. Each piece of fruit was numbered, and he saw that one was missing, and it wasn't on the ground. Where was it? And in the evening before, the orcharder had noticed, had seen this woman come in with her hands tied behind her back, and next to her was this beautiful angel-looking person. And he was totally spooked. He didn't know. So he didn't say anything on that occasion to the king. But now he had to fess up and say, yes, this is what I saw last night. The king was astonished, and he said, but I'll come back. I'll come back tonight and to see if she also comes back. So the king brought his high priest or wizard with him, and the high priest, the king, and the orcharder sat waiting. And sure enough, the water was dried up again, the moat. And the angel accompanied the young woman into the orchard, and again she ate. And the king approached her then and said, who are you? What are you? Are you a positive? A positive creature, or you're a negative creature? Are you evil or you are angelic? And the young woman says, I'm just a poor woman without any assets, without any hands. And I've been helped by this angel figure. And the king said to her, well, you've been abandoned, but I will not abandon you. Come to my palace and I'll look after you. So she goes to the palace, and the king falls in love with her and says to her, I'll have some silver hands made for you so that you won't be embarrassed in the court, in my court, amongst all my other people. So he had these beautiful silver hands made for her. Because he had fallen in love with her, she agreed to marry him. And as it often happens, the king was called away into battle. And he said to his mother, please look after my wife. And if she is pregnant, then I want you to look after the child that will be my son or daughter. So the mother agrees and says, yes, of course, absolutely. The king goes off, and sure enough, the young queen is pregnant. And eventually she gives birth to a beautiful son. And so the queen mother writes a letter to the king saying, yeah, come back quickly. We have a beautiful son. Come back and celebrate with us. And she gives the letter to a courier who takes it off to deliver to the king. in a faraway country. And on his way, he stops at a creek to have a rest and falls asleep. And the devil returns and swaps that letter with a letter of his own, saying that the young queen had given birth to a monster. And this is what the king receives, a letter saying that he now has a monster as a child. But he writes back saying to the queen mother, "Please look after my daughter and my child. I'm returning immediately. Do everything you can and respond to every need that they have." He gives it to the courier. The courier again rests at a creek and falls asleep. And the devil swaps another letter, this time saying, as if it's from the king, "This monster has to be killed. It's intolerable that such a being exists in my kingdom. And to prove that this has been done, I want her tongue cut out and her eyes plucked out as proof that not only has she been killed, but so has the monster." Well, the queen mother receives this letter and says, "I can't do this. This is impossible." So she had a young doe killed and the tongue of the doe and the eyes of the doe brought in as a substitute. And she said to the young queen, "You must leave. You must go into the forest and never return." So the young queen sets off again with her stumps tied behind her back. And this time, the baby is tied onto her back. And she goes off with her silver hands. Wanders and wanders, knowing not what to do. And again, towards the end of the day, when she's desperate and feeling like she did once before, hopeless and helpless, she pleads to God, "Help me in this time of my great need." And God again sends an angel who shows her directions to a little cottage. And outside the cottage, there was a sign, "Everyone is free to enter here. When you enter here, you will be free." So she knocks on the cottage door and is welcomed by another angelic being and told, "You can live here. You can live here freely, and we will look after you." So she unties the baby from the young queen's back, holds it up to the queen's breast for milk, and makes a bed ready for them, gives the queen something to eat. Meanwhile, the king has returned, confronts his mother. Mother confronts him. "Why did you do this? You're such an awful boy, awful son. You've done this to this young woman." And he said, "No, I haven't. The devil. It's the devil. The devil must have intervened." And sure enough. So the king in desperation makes a vow to God that he won't eat or drink anything until he finds his wife and son, even if he has to die beforehand. And so for 7 years, he looks without eating or drinking, only sustained again by the power of some supernatural force. And after 7 years, he comes in the forest to this little cottage and sees the sign outside, "Everyone who enters here will be free." He knocks on the door, and the angel figure opens the door and says, "Welcome, King. Come on in. We've been waiting for you." The king goes inside, and she offers him food and drink. He says, no, I just want to sleep." And he explains what he's doing. And the angel says, "I know, but sleep here." And in the morning, the young queen goes to him and says, "You don't know who I am, but I'm your wife, and this is your son." And he says, "You can't be my wife. My wife has silver hands." And she explains that living in this house where people could be free, her hands grew back. "And this is your son." And the story concludes by them embracing, going back to the kingdom and celebrating with everyone and marrying for a second time. That's the story. So now let's pause for a moment and begin to tease apart, if you like, the meaning of this story. Remember here that every aspect of the story, every aspect, every figure, every image is an aspect of our inner life. And it's good not to get too caught up in the narrative of the story as if it actually happened in real life. That there was king, queen, daughter, devil, and so on. But they're archetypal forces in our own life. So let's look at the first theme: the father, the mother, the devil, and the daughter. What comes across to my mind immediately is that the young woman's parents couldn't give her what she needed. What she wanted was not in the realm of possibility if she were to stay in their house. The story begins with an account of the miller and how he was fallen into poverty and had to work the mill himself, milling the grain. And we know how the mill worked in those days. You had to drive 2 big stones together. And usually if you had money or slaves, they'd do it for, if you had money, you'd have an ox or 2, or if you had slaves, the slaves would do it. And they'd be blindfolded because they were going round and round so they wouldn't get giddy. So we can imagine here the miller having to do it himself and blindfolding himself so he could push the mill around and round and not get giddy. So here we have an image of the miller blinded to what was actually happening. Had the young woman stayed in the father's house, she would have shriveled. And here, to amplify what might have happened, the words of Bette Midler's song, "The Rose," would have been her ongoing reality. It's the heart afraid of breaking that never learns to dance. It's the dream afraid of waking that never takes a chance. It's the one who won't be taken, who cannot seem to give, and the soul afraid of dying that never learns to live. So the theme here maybe is in the last couple of lines, and the soul afraid of dying that never learns to live. The young woman had to leave. Only with leaving could she begin her quest. This is a profound psychological truth. That all the goodwill and all the good knowledge in the world can't help us, certainly couldn't help this young woman. She had to leave. And in a way, her parents had to betray her. How could they not? And some of you might have read James Hillman's wonderful essay on betrayal, the necessity of betrayal. And the story tells us that before having her hands cut off, she attended to her parents' needs. She was dutiful and respectful. After losing her hands, she had to attend to someone else's needs than her parents. But whose needs? What needs? The devil, symbolically, is an archetypal force, a necessary force, a shadow force, a very disruptive force. We don't welcome the devil. The devil comes and intervenes. In our daily life, we want things to be straightforward, but that's not how life is. Neither our inner life follows a straight trajectory or our outer life. There are necessary peaks and vales that constitute our life's journey. Especially our inner life. I mean, outer life, we have the peaks and vales too, but the inner life has its share of peaks and vales, and those peaks and vales are driven by what Jung called archetypal forces. Her having to leave home demanded that she would, through her journey into the forest, overcome thinking about herself. This is a paradox of not privileging the ego. And I said right at the start that Jung in his writings and in his work did not privilege the ego. Her journey into the forest was to find someone who could do for her what she needed, what her parents could not do for her. She didn't know what she needed, but she knew that she had to leave. And that's a common experience. We don't see the path ahead. We just know we have to leave. The status quo has to be disrupted. Her not knowing, to my mind, is of critical importance. And that comes through a few times in the story. And this is so different to our normal psychological world where understanding is everything. She's not seeking understanding. She's certainly not seeking an explanation. Rather, she wants to find her transformation. A word that is not used in mainstream psychology, but is a very Jungian notion. Her personal, individual transformation. Not the ego dominating, but something like what Jung called a transcendent function. Something that arises up, erupts from within, that sits alongside the ego. Doesn't eradicate the ego, but sits alongside. So this is not a quest for someone to understand her, someone who would appreciate her crisis, which is what we all like in the outer world. No, her quest is for someone who can assist her with her transformation. And the transformation, as we understand it, is a movement from the outer life to the inner life. That's the transformation that the story is driving home. Her parents couldn't recognize what she needed. Her father explicitly offers her physical and financial security. He says, we'll look after you here. Stay with us. We'll look after you. And the words of the story are, I have gained great wealth through you. I shall take care of you in splendor as long as you live. To which she answers a resounding no. I cannot remain here. I will go away. Very clear, very determined. What we find so difficult in ourselves, and this is what the young woman illustrates, is that she had no mastery over what she was doing or where she was going. No plan, no strategy, no mission statement. She headed out not knowing. She headed out without any clear purpose. Her only purpose was a strongly felt need to leave. So what forced her to leave was the impossibility of staying in the wrong place. The wrong place was a place of no nourishment. No soul food available at all. This is how we distinguish what we need to do. Is there soul food here? Is this nourishing my soul, or is this diminishing my soul? The purpose of her leaving her and the purpose of her journey is to have no purpose. That's a challenge for us rational human beings. Us educated individuals who really love our sense of meaning, finding meaning, making meaning, understanding, trying to find explanations for the mysteries of life. And the words of the story are sort of beautiful in their own way. She had her mutilated arms tied to her back, and at sunrise she set forth, walking the entire day until it was night. That's the image. A difficult one to sit with, and a difficult one for us to live with when it happens to us. There's a lovely poem, a Spanish poem from way back 1912 by Antonio Machado, which conveys the importance of not knowing where you're going when it's a matter of the inner life. Here it goes. Wanderer, your footsteps are the road and nothing more. Wanderer, there is no road. The road is made by walking. Walking makes the road, and turning to look back, you see the path that you will never tread again. Wanderer, there is no road, only foam trails on the sea. So this is not just a Jungian idea. This is an idea that comes through, I reckon, every tradition of deep wisdom. There is no laid down path that we need to find and then follow. We put our own feet forward into the unknown, step by step. And it's only when we look back we can see where we've come from. So this is the contrast between the inner world and the outer world. And remember I said that her transformation amounted to a movement from the outer to the inner, from relying on the outer world to relying on the inner world. Not that she gave up on the outer world. That's not the point of the story at all. But the inner world becomes, at this time in her life, of at least equal importance. The next phase, I think, or aspect of the story, which I want to dwell on, after her beginning, setting things in motion, is her experience of helplessness and hopelessness. This seems to be a very important aspect of the journey. The words of the story are, she knelt down and crying out to God, she prayed. So when this story was collected in Europe, a very Christian tradition was pervasive. And so there was a very clear knowledge of God and angels. We don't have it as clear as that today. But let's just assume that the experience of helplessness and hopelessness impelled her to open her heart, open her soul, and say, I can't do this on my own. I have no strategies, I have no power, no agency. And that acknowledgement and acceptance was the invitation for the archetypal force to come in. And the archetypal force that she invited in this case, was an archangel, the figure of an angel. And we know that angels are important symbols. In Greek mythology, Hermes was the figure, the angelic figure, if you like, the communicator between us humans and the divine, a messenger between the humans, we humans and the divine. And in the Christian story, the Archangel Gabriel was the messenger to the Virgin Mary, again, the messenger. So in this case, this very particular archetypal force in the form of an angel connects her to her divine. In the words of the story, the angel dried up the moat so she was able to enter the garden. She stepped up to a pear tree and ate from it. I think I said an apple, but a pear tree, same thing, with her mouth, enough to satisfy her, but no more. So let's move on to the next phase that I see it, or the next movement. The king, the marriage, and the silver hands. The king made her a promise when he first saw her. He said, "Even if you have been abandoned by the whole world, I will not abandon you." But there's some lopsided qualities in this relationship. It just doesn't feel right. Does he see her for who she is? Remember the Rosie Batty little piece I told you about? We could not meet Rosie Batty as an individual, as a person. We only met her as a hero or as a villain. Does the king accept her as she is? And here are the words to remind us that he actually doesn't. He took her home with him to his royal castle, and because she was so beautiful and pure, he loved her with all his heart, had silver hands made for her, and took her as his wife. Now, if that's not lopsided, I don't know what is. And how are we to trust such a promise from anyone or any aspect of the world we live in? Whether it's technology or false hope, so that already creates in one's mind, heck on, something is not right here, something terrible is going to happen. The baby and the devil is the next phase. And another invitation for the dark archetypal force to return. The beautiful sun this time brings the archetypal force personified in the person of the devil back out of the shadows. Why is this dark quality so necessary for the next transition? Why does it have to be so difficult? We ask ourselves when we're in the depth of a depression, when we're in the depth of not having any agency in our life. Why is this dark quality so necessary for the next transition? And it seems that this archetypal force has to take us over. All we can do is just let it happen. We can't fight the archetypal force. We can say no to it and walk away, but it does not go away, it returns. The next phase of the journey is the king and the child were not enough. In the words of the story, the old woman, that's the queen mother, tied the young queen's child onto her back, and the poor young woman went away with weeping eyes. She came to a great wild forest where she got on her knees and prayed to God. Then the angel returned and led her to a small house. On the house was a small sign with the words, "Here anyone can be free." What sort of freedom is she talking about? Here anyone can be free. Marie-Louise von Franz, who I quoted earlier, I really like the way she works with fairy stories and alchemy. She sees the forest as a symbol of temenos, that place where each one of us needs to go in order to do our essential inner work. And for our young queen, this little cottage in the forest with the words on the outside, "Here anyone can be free," is her temenos, the essential place that she needs to go to in order to do her inner work. It's like it hadn't really started yet. It has, of course. But for 7 years, she lives in relationships that are nourishing. The angel in the story is a very positive image, and for some, angels work. For others, they require a much earthier image, Something akin to the hairy old man who lives in the swamp can be the archetypal positive image. So it doesn't have to be angelic. We know in our dreams, these archetypal forces come in images, and they're bewildering, often bewildering, such as the old man, hairy old man in a swamp, or some character from our past, even our adolescence, some early relationship person. And we ask ourselves, why is this turning up now? Why am I having this sort of dream? And then we have to think, well, this could be an archetypal force symbolizing in the person of this individual what I need to be taken up, overwhelmed by. Let's just spend a moment on this notion of transformation. It's such a tantalizing word. I think it needs to mean something very different for every one of us, rather than having a set meaning. While there are many differences between you and I on our experience of transformation, the story tells us that we know we're there when we've arrived at a place of nourishment of the soul. It can be a very fragmentary place. It can be a momentary place, an ephemeral place, but we know a place that nourishes the soul when we find one. A place, a space, an environment. Looking at the story, we can see that, if you like, the queenly aspect of the Psyche. She was given what she needed. My understanding, loving acceptance. She was giving what she needed, and her hands grew back. The king, from a kingly aspect of the Psyche then, came the capacity not to eat or drink for 7 years, and all the time trusting in a power greater than his ego. That was the kingly aspect. A different sort of relationship than the queenly aspect. She had the loving acceptance. He had a gutsy determination, trusting on a power greater than his ego. He too had to accept the sign, here anyone can be free. Accept the invitation and enter the cottage. We know 7 is a very symbolic number. It's like saying forever and a day. 7 years referring to inner work implies that it's certainly no walk in the park. 7 years implies that inner work is ongoing. It's a verb, it's not a noun. It's ongoing, continuous, daily, 7 years. Together, they return to the castle and remarry. And in symbology, the second marriage always signifies a union of the inner life with the outer life. The second marriage. And in my terms, in my mind, for me personally, It's the marriage of traditional psychology with Jungian psychology. In the personal life, then, it's acknowledging, as Jung did, that we, whether we know it or not, we aspire for an inner life. We aspire for some union with the divine. And Jung saw this desire as an inherent motivational driver, largely unconscious, but real all the same. It's going to work with us whether we wanted to or not. Whether we listen to it or not, we're going to feel the force of this motivational driver for union with the divine, however we define divine. I mean, what I've done illustrating Jung's tonight is to illustrate Jung's circumambulation. I'm trying to look at trauma not in a structured way, not mapping out the beginning, middle, and end, but trying to convey that alongside managing the symptoms of trauma and reducing them, it's essential that we acknowledge the work of the inner life and what the inner life calls us to do through trauma. You know, Jung was very explicit. He saw the symptoms of trauma as a form of communication, a form of communication. And as such, it's a language that we can understand if we work hard enough and learn the language, the vocab, the syntax, everything. He also asserted that our symptoms, no matter how distressing they are, nightmares, flashbacks, depression, deep anxiety, are an attempt at self-cure, an attempt at self-cure. And the attempt sort of works. We also know that these attempts at self-cure often turn into a monster. It's like they become a protective force for a while, and then they turn and attack us. And Jung again asserted that our motivational drivers include one that has a numinous quality, so I was referring to before. A spiritual driver, a force that seeks to bridge heaven and earth, the material and the divine, the inner and the outer. And he said, don't forget that this motivational driver, the spiritual driver, is largely unconscious. It has a largely unconscious component. And the unconscious is both personal and collective. And so we can look back at the story and ask ourselves, what has been a positive angel influence in my life? What has been a negative devil influence? And how have those disruptors forces worked for me? How have I worked with them? Jung, especially in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, talks about how he had to work and how he did work with his inner dialogue, his imagination, all his life. He never finished the job. He used active imagination, he used journal keeping, he used drawing mandalas, building models in mud and stone, all his life. And these strategies, if you like, have been refined by his colleagues as methods of psychotherapeutic technique, which are used today. So in conclusion, so looking at the clock, I can see it's time to conclude. We owe a lot to Jung, especially his assertion of the ongoing importance of believing in and celebrating the place of the inner life in this world of ours that is so committed to success in the outer life. I love the way, right from his earliest breath to his last breath, he wanted us, and he showed that he believed in and wanted to celebrate the place of the inner life and not put all our eggs in the basket of success in the outer life. So I'll conclude my formal presentation there and be happy to address any comments, questions, disagreements, whatever, for a bit. Okay, over to you, the chair.
Oh. Yes, so anyone would like to make a comment? Thank you very much, David. It's been amazing and insightful. Thank you very much. And it makes us realise there's a lot of things that we need to be addressing in our lives, particularly now with the virus, the coronavirus, and all the issues relating to all these things. This makes life very complicated.
Yep.
Can I ask Jeanne how we want to manage this process? We still have everybody on mute.
Yeah.
I suggest that I unmute everybody,
Yeah.
and perhaps get people to indicate if they. Well, how do you want to handle it? Shall I just unmute everybody and
Yes,
then
I think so.
and then if people wish, they can mute themselves again, or I'll mute them if they're noisy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because trouble.
I think so. Yes, let's do that.
Yeah.
We have a chat message. From Tina.
There it goes.
No, that's Tina's about to speak, I think, because she came up as
Well, the microphone's picking it up right now.
Well, just to repeat, David, in case you can't see Tina's message, she asks, you mentioned about the necessity of betrayal.
Yep.
Can you please advise me the book? Thank you.
Okay, James Hillman. If you just look up on the web, James Hillman, Betrayal, you can download a copy of it for free. There are a few Hillman sites, and I'm sure there's one there which will have it for free. It's a very confronting essay, worth reading several times, because he does what Jung did. He doesn't lay it out clearly in a systematic way to make it easy. He wants us to work hard at understanding how come love implies betrayal and how come we betray the people we love. It's a very challenging, wonderful paper.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is anyone else with questions?
I have a question, but who else wanted to? I think
Robert.
I just want to make a comment that there's a wonderful book called Love and Betrayal by Aldo Carottenuto.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and I found that extraordinarily challenging.
Yes. Likewise, Robert. That's another great reference. And I like him as a writer, Jungian writer as well, very much so. Yeah.
Who was that second writer's name?
Aldo Carottenuto, who's a Rome-based Italian psychoanalytical psychologist. I've got the book here, actually. I'll see if I can find it. Here we go. That's wonderful. That's very... To love and to betray. Isn't that marvellous?
The name of the writer. Just
Oh,
call it.
there we go.
You spell it, please.
C-A-R-O-T-E-N-U-T-O. To love, to betray.
Caro tenuto means dearly held in Italian.
Very good. That's
He's a man who really lived this too.
yes. And the parents, the point of betrayal in the story is that she couldn't have made her inner journey if her parents hadn't betrayed her. Psychologically speaking, we're not speaking as if it's a sociological real life story, but the parents, the authority figures, the establishment, the status quo had to betray her in a radical way, cutting off her hands, in order for her to begin her journey. That's extraordinary, an extraordinary truth.
Now, one of the great stories of betrayal in history is the betrayal of Christ by Judas.
Yes.
And which is a great archetypal story. And here within Christianity, we find these symbols of transformation and liberation that you've been discussing, and yet contemporary secular psychology has this strange aversion to religion. I suppose the scale of irrationality in religion, it's seen like Freud saw it as some dark rising tide of mud. That feeling of the irrationality of religion seems to exclude the spiritual in a way that makes our souls shrivel up.
Yes. And I think Jung, made several comments about religion and inferred that it had lost its enthusiasm, it had lost its passion. It had become regimented, lost its soul, he would even say. And so we need to revisit our need for that spiritual dimension in a very personal manner. One that is drawn by our passion for the impossible, for building a bridge to the divine. If that's not impossible, nothing's impossible. Yet it's what we need to pursue, so Jung would say.
This is Trish. You can't see us at the moment, but so David, thank you so much for the talk. It was very valuable. But I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the significance of the water. Water seems to come into the story quite often.
Yes.
In relation to the washing the hands at first, getting the power. With that circle,
yes.
The moat, the water came out of the moat,
yes.
And also as another, I know, I understand there's quite a few different versions of the story, and one of the versions is that she puts the stumps of her hands into a stream,
yes, that's right.
water, and the hands grow back. So I'm just wondering, water seems to be
water is symbolic.
As a thing, like in her tears and
her
cleaning
tears.
her hands, and it seems to come up all the time.
It does, and it needs to, doesn't it? And it does in every culture too, which is fascinating in itself. But it's in our Jungian understanding, it symbolizes the unconscious. It symbolizes the dream material, and acknowledging that I can't do this rationally, I can't do this through understanding. So the washing of the hands, consciously or unconsciously, because it was her tears that washed them on the second time. And again, that's that version of the story where it was her baby fell off her back into the stream, and she pushed her stumps in to pick up the baby, and in picking up the baby with her stumps, the hands grew back. And so it's to my mind, it's this move to trusting our unconscious processes, when they appear, not to give them the flick, but to welcome them in. And that's what the water symbolizes. In a dream, when there's water present of any shape or form, it's inviting us to say, hang on, what unconscious force might be knocking at my door? So it doesn't give a clear impression. It's not like Christian baptism, get rid of original sin, nice and tidy. No, it's an invitation for us to look, open our eyes and open our mind and heart to the unconscious. How can I invite the unknown, these unconscious forces into my life? Which each one of us has this challenge presented to us day in and day out.
David, it's Dorothea here. Can you
hello,
enlarge?
Dorothea.
Hi. Can you enlarge on the role of the devil?
Yes, the devil. The devil, again, this is, a Christian version by the time the Grimm brothers collected it. But there was an old, in early Roman times, there was the similar sounding word, the demon, the daemon. The daemon was like a soul force. The daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N, daemon was like a force on your shoulder who could interact with you, and it sort of got demonized, to make a pun, into a devil. But it's an archetypal force that is a soul force, that is a protective, much like the guardian angel, is a protective force. And it's a strong force. And so we are too quick to make evaluations of what is good and what is bad. So we do this thing too quickly about having angels, devils, but actually we look at an archetypal force as a polarity, if you like, of two extremes, two pure forms, and we need to draw the force from both. So the daemon is very personal to us. Each one of us has archetypal forces that Jung personified. He gave them, for himself, he gave them names. And, we don't have to do that. But what he invites us to do, and what I'm inviting you to do, is welcome this, when you feel the force of any quality, like in a dream, like in a synchronistic sense, a shiver up the back, or just an extraordinary meeting that we're sort of swept away by or taken aback by. Something is happening. A demonic force is moving within us, and it's from within. So it's not like a devil on your back, it's actually coming from within. And so Jung would say our dreams and our night dreams and our daytime reveries hold images of these demonic forces. And it's up to us not to be too culturally conditioned and see them as good or bad, but just to be open our consciousness to the force, to the energy, to the sense of presence, whatever we call it. But we know in our experience that this is a sense of presence. Is when it's there, it's there. Or when there's a dream image, which we can't shake all day, we know something is inviting us to look, if we want to, look more deeply, open our eyes and look towards it. Shelve our rational consciousness for a while. Trust that the image, the feeling state has its own therapia, has its own wellness component. you can see how different this tone is and the language is different from mainstream psychology, even modern day psychology. Sort of what you find under the guise of well-being and self-development most often doesn't have this deep unconscious drive and invitation to trust the unknown that Jung was following. And he wasn't the first one. He was picking up on the earlier people, the alchemists and early post-Roman philosophers. And when he went to Africa and he went to China, the Chinese influence, East and West, he was open all the time to wherever images of archetypal forces could be found. He wanted to know about it and he wanted to dwell in that place.
David, I was hoping you could speak a bit more about trauma and therapy for trauma. Like there's such an interest in post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yep.
And the whole question of how our society recognizes and copes with trauma, and the extent to which either counseling or drug treatment are effective therapies, and so how some more deeper archetypal spiritual healing may be possible, because there's this remarkable story here of a spiritual, like what could be more traumatic than having your father chop off your hand because he sold you to the devil? Like it's just saying, this is an extreme betrayal, a complete, like she is completely, any normal person would be completely traumatized, and yet she somehow rises above that trauma.
And as we do when we open ourselves to the forces of the inner life. But let me go straight to your first part of your question, Robert. We need to, when we suffer, if any of us have suffered serious trauma, we need to start anywhere we can. And to my mind, the first beneficial thing is to find someone who can listen to us, who can take us seriously, meet us face to face, respect our story. If that doesn't happen, nothing else is going to happen much. No drugs or therapy is going to work, I don't think. Because we want to be attended to as a human being who has had a terrible experience. And that requires another human being, not a machine or robot or anything, another human being to say, I am willing to sit with you and I'm keen for you to tell me your experience as best you can and as fully as you can. Without that, my big assumption is nothing much is going to happen, although stuff does happen. I mean, we get through life. We get through life with all sorts of helping hands, with all sorts of, if you like, way stations, a sort of an anti-anxiety medication can help us through a patch. But it doesn't address the trauma. It helps us survive. It helps us go on for another day. But Jung's big assumption, and I'm following on that assumption, is that all these things can turn back on us. Like the protective covering of medication or the protective covering of counseling can turn in on us after a while as well. That's the power of this story and the power of the inner life, that if we don't attend to it, we can still keep living, but we'll become bitter and twisted or we'll live in a cocoon that cannot be opened up, the shell of the cocoon cannot be broken, but we'll still keep living. And we'll medicate ourselves somehow, or we'll, have a workout, an exercise routine, which will be demanding of us and time consuming for us, and we'll make do. But Jung's position is radical in this. He says you can't, especially in the second half of life, if you don't attend to the spiritual driving force, the spiritual dimension, you're going to get narrower and more contained and lack purpose. That your life is going to shrivel, or you'll become yourself dogmatic and authoritative. You're not going to have an open mind and an open heart if you cannot accept this imperative, especially in the second half of your life. So that was his, he didn't equivocate. This is why he's still important to us, because he's so different. And that he actually, I reckon, is in touch with our personal experience. That those in the second half of life, in the latter part of life, know in our bones that this is a truth he's speaking. That's why he's still important. So it's not to disparage the good work the trauma clinics do. The program is well researched. It's just lopsided, to use that Jung's favorite terminology when he was asked, but what about, modern psychiatry? Just say it's lopsided. And what he meant was one-sided. The side missing was what he was working at and had been working at all his life. And he, as I keep saying, he's not the first one, that there's a whole tradition in every culture of spiritual wisdom as a way of complementing ordinary everyday management of life.
So does the fairy tale serve as a form of popular psychology and a therapeutic healing process to open up a conversation about trauma?
If you open yourself to it, like I would suggest that any real fairy story has to be read and reread and almost learned off by heart, so that you embody it somehow, and then it starts to affect your dreams. And then there's movement. Then there's movement. Then things are beginning to happen. So you can't do the conceptual study of the fairy tale and think that it's going to bring forth fruit. It'll be interesting. And, there's a whole study of cultural anthropology, which looks at magic, and fairy tales and such things. But it's only, and it's the same with dream interpretation. There's a whole world of that too, but that's not what Jung's on about. Jung is saying, this is a personal thing. You open your heart and your soul to your imagery, your personal imagery, and you work with it. You let it talk to you. You put it on the kitchen table and you walk around it, circumambulation. Invite it to speak to you. And that's what, reading and rereading a fairy story can do that. Or all sorts of other things as well. Fairy stories, myths of any culture, working with your own dreams, working with your daydreams. It's all the same material in a sense. It's all, if we work with it with that open heart and open mind, we're inviting it to release something, which is, he referred to with the ego. He's trying to get the ego out of the way so that it's not the dominant controlling influence in our life. It's important, but it's not dominating. Whereas if you want to interpret dreams, the ego comes in and takes over. almost inevitably, because you want agency. You want to understand. And this is not about understanding. It's about inviting forces, energy, to nourish what is already there, your inner life.
There's a bunch of comments in the chat.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah. You better read them up, Robert. Yeah.
Jeff wanted to speak. He had trouble unmuting himself. I've unmuted him, so perhaps Jeff or Shauna might wish to speak. I hope they're unmuted. No, they're muted again. I can't. I don't know what's wrong. I can't. Oh, there we are. Now they're unmuted.
Now, I've had a few things I wanted to say along the way. I'm not sure now. There's just various times when you've been talking that I've wanted to. I guess the knowledge of when the ego's in control and you need to let something else take over. You feel that, and how to get into that space. You need to relax a lot and not do anything, because when you're going head first, determined and being determined and ego driven, it takes a long time to wind back from that.
Yes.
You can try to do tasks that seem to get you into a soulful state, but they can be ego driven.
They can.
So in the end, you've just kind of got to do nothing.
I think we know, when we feel we're in a pickle, when we feel we're wobbly, we're feeling wobbly, that's when you know the ego is being challenged. That's my assumption, okay? The ego is being challenged. So then the question is, what do I do now? I'm in a pickle. I feel confused. I feel frustrated. I feel angry. My world's disrupted. That's the starting point. That means the ego is being challenged by other, what Jung would call archetypal forces. And so to my mind, what one on a good day could do is invite that by asking an open-ended question, such as, I'm in this pickle, what is my soul asking of me right now? Open-ended question. You don't drive for an answer. Open-ended question. What is my soul asking of me? That's like the young woman at the end of her first day. That's the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. I'm in the pickle. I feel wobbly. I feel insecure. And instead of doing a little self-medication or going for a long walk or distracting ourselves with Netflix, one can say, what is my soul asking of me in this moment?
I think also, I don't mean to cut in, but it doesn't even have to be a disturbance like that. It can just be the flatness or the knowledge that you're one-sided. After a long time of being one-sided, there's just kind of the knowledge. I can't.
You know, Shauna, you do, don't you? Yep. Yep. And so you still got to then make the move yourself. You've got to use your mind to open yourself up. It won't happen automatically. You can feel the need sometimes. I need to do something different. I don't know what it is, but I can feel this hunger, this longing, but I don't know what it means. So that's movement.
I think even just knowing that we have to be guided or motivated by something which is beyond ourselves. And when it is just ourselves, you know, that we do the work for, we hit a wall eventually. You know, when you hit a wall, it's like you've got to stop, and then you just got to stop for a while. And it, like you say, it is those images that the soul, or the soul will tell us what to do, but we can't hear that until we just stop.
And I mean, Jung would do a mandala, or he'd get his chisel and hammer out and chisel at a bit of stone, or chop wood, or you know, go into his tower for a month or so. He was, and we do something equivalent. We need to change our mindset, another. We need to open ourselves up in whatever way we know how we do that. And we do it all differently, each one of us. But it's like, how can I find myself in a fertile field now? Each one of us has our version of doing this, even if we've only done it for a moment or two. There's something about, you know, you find a certain place that feels like, oh, I feel at home here. It might be sitting under a particular tree in a particular place. So that's what I mean by a movement. We move, okay, I'll go there and I'll sit under that tree and I'll just open myself. That's, to my mind, a great movement, a great psychological movement. It's a movement of the psyche, because you're responding as psyche indicates how you need to respond. So this tradition, this Jungian tradition, tells us.
I just think it's wonderful that we can trust our unconscious, because when we go in the wrong direction, it'll eventually just, you know, kind of let us.
It comes back to us. It returns. That's right. It does. Not that we'll listen to it the next time either. I mean, we can be very stubborn, very resistant to all the possible invitations. And often we need someone else, someone close, who knows us, who can say, I think you're missing the obvious. I think there's something hidden in plain sight which you're not seeing. And we, oh, you think so? Yes, I think so. That can just, another human being can do this for us.
David, I might read a question from Elmars, and I can. Elmars might wish to speak as well. He's asked, "Hi, is there a bootstrap problem? You said that you need to understand the psyche only with the psyche, nothing else. What do you see the psyche to be?"
There's always a bootstrap problem. Always. We can't, look at ourselves through anything other than our own eyes. And so, yeah, it's circular. And that's what consciousness is. It's a business of reflecting and opening. I mean, this is it's not a very popular notion these days, is that we have these dynamic forces, what we used to call instincts, motivational drivers, that are largely unconscious in their focus. And we have a mind which has been educated to management and control and understanding. And these two processes are somewhat on different paths. Both are real. We need to do both. And so we need to cultivate our minds to be active investigators, creative, inquiring minds. And alongside that, we need to open ourselves with the belief that we have driving forces, motivational drivers from within that we were born with, that have come through generations, like all our inherited attributes. And these we can acknowledge and we can learn to trust, which is fascinating. So this is the parallel path, if you like, which I was alluding to right at the start. You have scientific psychology, rational, highly managed, highly organized, and you have this other opening, more organic thing that are our drivers, our emotional drivers, and largely are unconscious, outside of our awareness. But we feel them and we know them when we're in trouble, because that's when they disrupt us particularly. So yeah, bootstraps is there. There's just no, of course, it's not a problem. It's the way it is for part of our daily living.
There is, this is Elmas. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can see your photo now. Yep.
Yeah, I've just been really impressed, and I've said this before, that there is another way of approaching it. And this guy called Jordan Peterson, who's really looked at things. He's both a traditional psychologist and a Jungian, amongst other things, plus he's quite well known. And he takes this evolutionary view of the collective unconscious that Jung talks about, and he sort of builds it into a model where all these things are bootstrapped into that evolutionary aspect of existence. He says you are in fact the product of 4 billion years or whatever, and all your componentry is built in to do things. So his instincts are kind of built upon those structures, like the hierarchical structures of the serotonin system and stuff like that. So I always get confused. I was always confused by the collective unconscious concept, but you're going back to it. You're going back to say you have to only consider the psyche in terms of the psyche, and you have to detach that from things like experience, things that, but you bring in beliefs and things. So to me, it's a kind of hard to.
It's like being multilingual, Elmas. It's like having two languages, at least, and being fluent in both, and not seeing them in contradiction, and trusting both to do different jobs, because they follow different logics. That's why they need to do different jobs.
So there's the total schism there, but they're both logical.
They're logic of a different sort.
What is the sort of logic?
Both are rational,
yes,
but different sorts of rationality. And
what does that mean?
Say there are different, and this is quite common these days, different ways of knowing. You know, there's a mytho-poetic way of knowing. There's a scientific way of knowing. And even in science, there's...
the mytho-poetic one is not rational. There's no doubt about that.
Well, it's rational in a sort. It's got its own sort of rationality.
Not.
It's got its own poems, and myths have a quality of understandability.
Sure.
And we can be influenced by them. So they are not rationalistic in that.
Rationality means one thing ratioed relative to another, like a ratio of numbers.
That's a way of looking at it.
No, so that's the definition of rationality.
Yeah, well, Jung, we've got to stay in the frame here, if you like. I'll try and stay in the frame. Jung didn't like single definitions because he says that's good for the realm of indeed single definitions. But if you're going to look at love and betrayal, longing, then you're going to run into trouble if you're going to have literal definitions, because they won't do the job.
I'm not saying you need literal definitions.
Well, rational, your definition, if I might say.
No, you're saying that there are two sorts of rationality, which is...
I'm saying there are numbers of sorts of rationalities, not two. Like
Okay.
I said right at the start, there's no single
Definition
truth.
of no definition.
No definitions are useful in as far as they're useful.
Well,
So-
one way of saying that there are multiple forms of rationality is to say that there's the order that we impose on the world through our logical reason, and there's the deep order of the cosmos itself, which is beyond our knowledge. And it has like the cosmos and archetypes have their own orderly paths, but we don't understand those paths. And we too much, I think, in the modern world, we have a tendency to say only what we understand and describe and articulate is real. And yet...
Well, then I go back to my original question. Or what do you call the psyche? What is it?
The
The thing that you have to use to understand the psyche.
The psyche, my definition, we all differ on this, so my experiential definition.
No, but you had to chop experience out of it. You did that right at the beginning.
No.
Yes,
no,
you did.
No, I did that to illustrate a point, but experience is the beginning and end because it's what we have. So I can't chop it out. In language, we have to do all sorts of shortcuts because language is like that. But experience is what I wanted to illustrate when I used the Rosie Batty example, is that we did not appreciate, we did not attend to her experience. We made her into a person, a character, and wondered about her and so on. And then I emphasized Jung met the person he was working with as a person. Now that means he acknowledged that person's experience. And it's what I said to Robert there right at the start. We listen attentively to another person's experience if it's a matter of trauma. We listen in as much detail as possible to their experience. And we allow ourselves to meet that experience with our experience. So I'm sorry if I led you astray in cutting out experience. I want to emphasize experience. And I want to see the psyche as how I experience this inner life.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. That's great.
David,
how I experience the inner life.
I was hoping that we could invite a question from Francis Kaleli. Oh, what happened there? Francis asked, I'm getting feedback on mine, so I'll just invite Francis to speak.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're good. Okay.
I was wanting to ask, I might just comment first that I love the idea of inviting these archetypes in. I also think it's handy sometimes to see them as invitations in themselves. You know, this is an invitation, this painful feeling or this uncomfortable feeling or whatever it is something that can, on occasions, very rare and rarer, and I wish more often, but lead me to my journal where I can start to process them. But I did want to ask, I shouldn't say, and I want to ask a question. Can you become too absorbed in the inner world and at times? And how do you know when you're not in a healthy place? You know, I know rationally there's a thing called clinical depression and psychosis. And a person on their own, can they become too absorbed? Are there dangers in going into the unconscious?
Yes, always.
Okay.
Always. Because Jung described an archetype as being bipolar, that there's an extreme form at each end of the pole. Each end is dangerous. So I've used the story of Cinderella, if you like, on previous talks, where the fairy godmother represents an archetypal form of pure goodness. The stepmother represents an archetypal form of evil. And so, but they're pure forms. if we go towards either one, we're in trouble, because we want the inner life as if it was a giving over. Whereas Jung would say, draw the energy from both the fairy godmother and the evil stepmother, draw it into yourself and be your own mother. Be fertile, be creative yourself by drawing the forces in. It's when the ego wants us to give over to the fairy godmother. Ego wants us, and it does happen, to give over to the nasty stepmother. So that's the fine line is this drawing the energy consciously and bringing it forth in a creative way. So Cinderella finding her own motherhood, and just, yeah.
Can you do it on your own, or do you have to, are there dangers in doing it on your own, or do you need another person?
Oh, I don't know. We're all different here. We're all different. I mean, people have done it on their own for ages. Doesn't necessarily work doing it with someone else either. It's mainly a process for yourself, because we have the capacity to do this. We have the capacity to have an inner dialogue. We have the capacity to evaluate that dialogue, make judgments about it. We have the capacity to articulate to ourselves and to others what's happening to us. The more we do that, the better. The more, if we become narrow and rigid and self-contained, then we get into trouble. Okay. Or if we believe we've found the truth, we think, oh, that's a bit problematic.
Thank you.
Good on you, Francis.
I think our last question is from John, and he's asked, well, either John and Mary could read out the question themselves, but I'll read it anyway. With all the extra hand washing we are all doing due to the corona epidemic, is that an indication of a subconscious awakening?
I don't think so. No, I think it's hand washing. Full stop. No, I don't think so. But we could ritualize going to a creek, or in this wet weather, standing in the rain, and consciously do, the light of a full moon in the rain, and open ourselves in an invitational way. That's going to work somewhat. Washing your hands per se, because of the virus, just can't work.
Really do.
Psychologically, no.
You don't think, because it's affecting the whole planet, you don't think that there is an awakening? We've all come to a standstill. Our old life is finished forever. The world is
We
changed.
have an opportunity. There might be a as I was saying in the story, the disruption that we are experiencing now collectively is an invitation. Whether we respond to the invitation or not is up to us individually and collectively, for that matter, but essentially individually. So just because there is a disruption does not mean we're going to open our heart and mind to it and invite unconscious forces to be present as resources that we can tap into.
Okay, thank you.
That's, could I add a comment here that your story about the chopping off of her hands in the story, the very drastic way that parental, what would you call it, protections all of a sudden changed to shove the child out into the world. That's a very drastic example, and it's a very relevant one where so many people are talking about blaming parents for things in the past rather than seeing that it gave them a necessary push to go out in the world and find themselves.
Well, again, just caution any direct parallel of the story to our social condition, because it's the parents in the story, if you like, symbolize the broader community and society, not in an abstract form, but the driving impulses of the society. The society we live in is very commercial, it's very material, it's very success-oriented, it's very competency-oriented. That's the cutting off the hands. It's believing in that. When I believe in that with my heart, that's the way I'm going to live, then I cut my hands off or have my hands cut off for me.
Mhm.
That's the imagery, I reckon, personally, that the story is conveying.
Yes, and the implication is for many who are looking for something to blame in order to find in their own predicament, that they don't look back too far, that it's a necessary step in their growth.
Yes. Yeah. Blaming is short term. It's a bit comfortable for a moment, but it bounces back and bites us.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Serves us no end.
Good.
Thank you. Okay. Now who's next?
Good. Have we run out?
There's more comments that I can see, but don't know.
Well, there was a discussion about James Hillman's book on the necessity of betrayal, and Dorothea provided a link. I had a look at that link and it didn't work. So just checking what the title of the paper by Hillman was. David, can you help us?
It's called Betrayal, but it's in a volume.
Right.
I think it's called Loose Ends, but I'm not sure about that, but I can let you know the reference.
Yeah, and perhaps that can go up on the Canberra Jung Society website.
Yes. How to access it off the... I'm pretty sure you can access it off the web, but I can do that. I can send the link. I'll send it to Joanne and Robert. Jeanne and Robert. Yeah.
So it's Loose Ends Primary Papers in Archetypal Psychology. That's available at Amazon. And then if people want to look for free copies, they can go hunting from the links there. I'll just put that.
It'll just be the article. The betrayal article is the one that stands alone as a free, I think so, as a free copy.
Yeah. So I've added the link to the Loose Ends.
Thanks, Robert.
And
good on you.
I'm wondering if we're getting towards the end. Jeanne and Robert might wish to. I tried to unmute you before. We can't unmute. It seems it's strange. There, I tried again. Now you can talk.
Yeah,
Okay.
here we are. Thanks. Yeah.
I'd like to say thank you very much, David. You've given us so much to think about, and so much in the future also, you know, with our books and ways of looking at things. So it's just been, and you know, thank you for everyone coming from interstate and from around Australia. It's and beyond. It's really great to have everyone coming in here for David. It's such a successful night, and we'll be in touch with you, David, along the road.
Thanks.
And
Robert, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everyone for being such a interactive
it's been very good. Very nice.
Yeah, thanks for all the interaction. A lot of contributions.
Yeah,
there.
thank you.
Good. A lot of contributions. Excellent discussion. Yeah. Okay. Lovely to see familiar faces.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Hello, Judith Bailey. Hello.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night. I'll end the session now.
Okay. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you
very much. Bye.